Coffee, Cows, and Crops is produced by the Peace Country Beef and Forage Association and hosted by Extension Coordinator Johanna Murray. On this podcast, we discuss management practices and research results with scientists, ranchers, researchers, and farmers. We strive to share innovative information and farming practices supported by sound science and practical wisdom. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get learning.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Coffee, Cows, and Crops. Today I'm chatting with Talon Gauthier, the Peace Forage Seed Association coordinator, and we'll be talking about pest monitoring and growth regulators and the Peace Forage seed industry. But before we get into all the fun stuff, Talon, would you like to introduce yourself and tell me a bit about how you got started with the Forage Seed Association?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. And so I live just outside of Dawson Creek, BC, actually, and I run a farm with my husband and our 3 kids. So we have a cow-calf operation, mostly commercials, and just actually starting to get into a few purebreds. I got started with the Forage Seed Association in 2010. I actually started as a summer student. And I was really looking for a job. I'd spent quite a bit of time traveling and gone to university. And so my now husband at the time said, you know, it would be really nice if you came home during the summer. So I called the Ministry of Agriculture office begging for them to find me a job in agriculture. And I got a call from Sandra Burton, and she hired me to basically pick weeds all summer for our variety trials. And then I just kept coming back. And then when I finished university, they offered me a job. So that's how I got into this.
Awesome. So what does the Peace Forage Association do?
So we're a nonprofit research and extension association, and basically just catering directly to grass, turf, and legume seed producers. So basically growing the crops that we kind of most commonly grow in the Peace for forage seed production. For turf, it would be creeping red fescue, perennial ryegrass, bluegrass, anything like that. And then for grasses, it would be timothy and bromes and wheatgrasses. And then for some legumes, we do a lot of clover production, some alfalfa production, and things like that.
Cool.
So everything that we kind of do is just catered around. It's a really niche industry. There is not, there's not a lot of research done on it by companies or at higher levels. So we have to kind of do a lot of our own stuff, and so that's what we focus on.
Interesting. So before we get right into the projects and stuff that you've done, I know the Peace Country itself produces a lot of forage seed. So can you tell me a bit about how the forage seed industry works in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously we grow the seed that then, seeded later for pasture mixes or hay fields. And then also the turf stuff, gets sent off, and that's what comes in your lawn mixes, or when you go to a golf course and it's nice and beautifully manicured, that's the seed that we are growing. About 80% of the seed that's grown in the Peace is actually exported outside of Canada. So a lot of it goes to the US as our main importer of forage seed. A lot goes to China and then to Europe. Those are kind of the 3 big countries that we export to. And we do a lot of turf production. So we can grow fescue really, really well. And so that is a large portion of what's grown. So we actually have a levy, and we use that data to kind of follow along with what crops are being sold and stuff like that. So in the last when you look at our levy data, about 70% of our levy comes from fescue. And then timothy would be the next biggest crop that's grown here. The bromes and the wheatgrasses are kind of neck and neck. And then actually quite recently, we've actually started to grow a lot more perennial ryegrass. And legumes make up a pretty small proportion of they're 5% or less of the production in the Peace. And so anyway, we are growing it, and we export a large chunk of it. Then the rest does go get sold. There's seed companies in the Peace that do take that seed then and retail it to local producers who are looking for it for pasture or hay mixes.
Right. That makes sense. So I know we touched a little bit in school on like the certified seed industry for like cash crops. And I know that a big part of seed production is keeping them clean and free of weeds and that sort of stuff. So when you're growing forages, a lot of the time you're dealing with more perennials and grasses and stuff. So what sort of plants are often weedy in forage crops? What are you really looking out for?
Yeah, so that's really true. So, and even when just kind of to backtrack too, actually a lot of the forage seed that we produce is actually common, which you would think then, well, that's odd in a sense, but there's not usually an issue with that, because to be a forage seed producer, you have to be extremely meticulous, because it is a perennial. And so you have to be, make sure that your fields are very clean and things like that in order to grow a good forage seed crop. So even though predominantly a lot of our production is common, it's actually really, grown with a really high amount of care, and they take a lot of like pride into their management and stuff like that. So the weeds and stuff, there are weeds, and we're really lucky in the Peace because, we think we have a lot of weeds here, but in comparison to a lot of other growing areas, like in the Peace country is actually one of the top forage seed production areas in the world. We're in the top 5. And
Wow.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. Oregon is number 1, but they have insane amounts of moisture, and therefore that comes along with insane amounts of weed problems and things that they have to tackle. And so we've been really, really lucky, but we are starting to get some issues. Annual bluegrass is becoming a huge issue for us. It's extremely hard to get out of a forage seed crop, and it grows. You can't spray your grass out of a grass. And so that becomes extremely challenging to manage. And so when I talked about how forage seed producers are really good managers, it's because you will actually see like a lot of guys out hand roguing fields in order to get on top of weed issues and stuff like that.
Wow.
Yeah. So, so that comes into a lot of their management practices, ensuring that they've got extremely clean fields when they seed down a grass crop, because it becomes really challenging afterwards to, take care of weed issues with herbicides and stuff like that later on, if that happens. Not to say it doesn't, and there are options in different, like certain crops. We do have herbicide options for certain things, but not a lot, not compared to other crops.
Right. That makes sense.
So we do all of our own herbicide testing, because when a company comes out with a chemical, they don't, because we have such a niche industry, typically they don't test those products on forage seed crops.
Oh.
So that's actually a big part. That's like a huge part of Calvin Yoder's job. And so we actually have hire him in part with Sarda Ag Research, but he does all of the field work, and especially in the herbicides and the growth regulators. So he tests all the products that come out that have any potential to be good on or safe on a forage seed crop. And then so he goes through all the testing, and then we actually submit those if we have a product that isn't showing damage or minimal damage and provides good control and stuff like that. He will submit all that data to the Prairie Pesticide Minor Use Consortium, and we will get that product with a minor use label. So then it's actually labeled for use on forage seed crops.
Right, that makes sense. And one more question on kind of growing forage seed before we get into more project stuff, but what sort of quality factors do you consider when you're raising forages for seed? Like I know with something like wheat, a big measurement is protein or seed weight or oil content in canola, but what are you looking for in forage seeds?
So some of those we don't do so much with like protein contents, but we do seed weight and stuff like that, which is obviously a lot different because our seeds are so much smaller than annual or grain crops are. So, but we do all of the work, like even we run variety trials, and so where we're testing, new varieties against, because a lot of the varieties that we grow in the Peace are actually from the 60s, and were developed right at AFC Beaver Lodge. And so those are still commonly a lot of the varieties that we use. And so we're always testing new varieties against those. And so when we do that, we're always measuring, we take yield samples, and then we do germinations and 1,000 kernel counts and stuff like that, just to see, the difference in comparison to what we already have. And then, how does that relate on in terms of vigor and then we also can watch, do those crops overwinter well in our climate, or do they winter kill easily? We have issues with, like, we don't have any new varieties of like tall fescue or orchard grass than, the ones that came out a long time ago, because there's lots of issues with winter hardiness in those crops. And in a forage seed stand, you typically would like to have it stay for 1 or 2 production years. And so, and sometimes like Timothy, even more than that, or wheatgrasses. And so you want to make sure that obviously that crop isn't going to die out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we talked very briefly about the work you've done with Calvin Yoder about getting herbicides certified and that sort of stuff for use in forages. So, but with herbicide resistance becoming more and more prevalent among a lot of our weedy species like wild oats and that sort of stuff, what are kind of the best practices for using herbicide in your seed forage crops?
Yeah, absolutely. And we are definitely starting to get some herbicide resistance. Narrowleaf hawksbeard is one that we actually do have some resistance. And last year, we were actually seeing some resistance to Assure 2, which is basically the only thing we have to get rid of foxtail barley and creeping red fescue. And so we were starting to see some resistance to that last year. And so we've been sending out samples and just to determine that if there actually is resistance. And so, best practices for using herbicides, obviously it's the same as, other crops. You would like to try and do, a pre-seed burn off to make sure that you are starting with a clean seed bed. You want to use fields that don't have a history of being super weedy. So, forage seed producers are typically picking their best fields if they can, because that crop needs a year to establish. Lots of times they will overseed an annual crop on top just to help. It's kind of like a divided in half, honestly. Like some guys, believe in seeding with a cover crop because one, you need that cash flow in that year of establishment. It helps to combat some of the weed pressures that could happen and so on. But then some guys believe that in not seeding with a cover crop because, they think that you get a better establishment if there's nothing competing with the forage seed crop that's there, but then it is more challenging because it obviously leaves more ability for weeds to kind of come in and try and take over in that first year. So, and there's really no right or wrong way to do it. It's just kind of what's worked well for that producer and what they continue, would believe and continue to do. So, but biggest things would be, starting with as clean a seed bed as possible. Lots of guys actually they say that they can't get rid of fescue because fescue, it grows so well in this country that they'll try to spray their fescue out and go into an annual crop rotation. And then that fall, when they take their annual crop off, the fescue is coming up underneath, and it's rejuvenated and it's coming so good that they don't even bother taking it out. They just say, okay, well, this field will be fescue again next year, I guess, even if they had planned for it to not be in fescue for a few years. So that kind of, and the fescue, like I said, we do a lot of turf production, and those varieties usually have a creeping root system, especially like the creeping red fescue, and that really helps to keep weed pressures down and so on. Calvin is always, anytime new products come out that could potentially, that have any potential, we're always testing them and trying them. We've been doing that research for years and years, and I don't see it ever not needing to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So to switch gears from the herbicide side of things to another kind of chemical, a set of trials I saw on your website that I'm really interested in is using growth regulators in forage crops. So before we talk about the trials in particular, how do growth regulators work?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a practice that's really commonly used in other parts of the world. Growth regulators are used in Oregon and New Zealand and everywhere else that grows a lot of forage seed. And it's just one of those management practices that we haven't really tested in Canada. And I think it's been slow to come for everything because it's only just recently been registered in Canada on wheat. And so we've been doing research on growth regulators for, my goodness, probably 10 years now. And we're just getting to a point now where we have enough data that we can start registering it on some of our forage seed crops. But the way that they work is, plant growth regulators are, it's a synthetic compound, and it's meant to either stimulate or inhibit the hormonal activity of a plant. And that's meant to either, promote or kind of like inhibit growth. And so, the ones that we use, there's two different ones that we use. They're trimexopeth ethyl or clomiquat chloride. And so we've been doing research on those two specifically and combinations of them. And basically, what it does is it inhibits the elongation between the nodes of a plant. And so what that does is we see if we have a lot of rain, we get a lot of lodging in our forage seed crops. And lodging can cause a lot of issues, especially if that crop is, so if it's tall and then it lodges over grasses, and specifically are wind pollinated. So to get seed production, they need to be pollinated. But, unlike a legume where it's pollinated by a bee, our grass crops are actually wind pollinated. So if that crop lodges and lays over, then it's not going to get pollinated as well. And so what the growth regulator does is it keeps the crop shorter so that it won't fall over or lodge, and then it actually will pollinate. And so what you find when you do research with that is that not only do you get like shorter crops, but then you get better yield because more of the crop was able to be pollinated because it didn't lodge.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So that's kind of, and like I said, they use it all over the world, but it's a really new thing to Canada. And we've been doing work on it, but we couldn't, until it got registered on a big crop like wheat, we couldn't put through a minor, because again, it has to be a minor use registration for us. And so we couldn't put through any minor use registrations until it became registered on a big crop.
Right. That makes sense. So you've mentioned some grasses and stuff that you've tested, but what kinds of forages have you tested with growth regulators, and what sort of stuff have you seen for results up here?
So when we first started, we actually started with the clovers because that was what it was used on before, because clovers, as you guys probably know, even in your forage trials, they can be extremely unruly. And it's really hard for the bees, the honeybees or the leafcutter bees to get in and pollinate those flowers because it's got such thick growth. And so when we first started, we started using them on clovers. And then as time kind of went on, then we switched over and started using them on our grass seed crops. So we had really good luck with them on clovers, worked really, really well, saw good yield results, saw really, really good shortening of the crop and so on. Same thing happened with our grass seed crops. The unfortunate thing is that the results are really variable. So just because we're not the same as Oregon knows they're going to get a lot of rain every year. And so they just apply growth regulators like they do it all the time because they know that it's wet. Whereas here, the Peace Country is typically really, really wet, but not always. So like last year was a really bad year to use a growth regulator, but sometimes you don't know that so the time when you need to apply is when it's at like I can't remember the exact node stage, but it's when the plant is really, really small. And so you apply it and then kind of hope that it's going to be wet afterwards. So, and we've had really good results because we've had some really wet years. And so on the years where it was really wet, we had phenomenal results. Last year was not the case because it was so dry. And I mean, last year was a big anomaly for us, but there was actually injuries and like reduced yields from where the growth regulators were applied, but it was so hard to predict that we were going to have a year like we did last year. So it's not 100%, and we're still doing work on it. There's still questions that we have on it, and so we are doing a little bit of work to get it submitted. So for some minor use stuff, but we still have quite a bit to go.
Makes sense. So I guess we'll change topics again and talk pests for a minute. When you're talking forage seed, what's kind of first pest that comes to mind? What are some big problem pests in forage seed production?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of the biggest ones that for us have been obviously the red clover case bearer was a big one that came in 2008 or so, and it actually really decimated the red clover industry in the Peace because we actually used to be huge growers of red clover, and then when the pest came in, you would get some seed yield in the first year, but then by the time that crop had been in for 2 years of seed production, the pest had basically taken away, like you'd have a beautiful stand of red clover and you'd go and harvest it for seed and there was nothing there. And so that has been a big issue for us. There are still some producers of red clover, but they typically try to get their seed production just in that first year because there's no point in leaving it in for a second year. And there's no good, we've still continued to monitor any products that come out. There's nothing that is out on the on the shelves, I guess, that we could even try to use as an insecticide to try and control it. And because we have so much, wild clover living in the ditches and in forage fields around, it overwinters really, really well in our climate. And there's so many hosts for it that, you can't even eradicate it by, just doing crop rotations or something like that because it's just living in the ditch right beside your field usually. So that's been a really big one for us. A new one that's come out that we've been monitoring pretty closely is European skipper and Timothy. And there was actually, I know that there was a big article done about it last year for SARDA and stuff like that, just because it's a pretty blue butterfly that everybody sees flying around in the summertime, and that's actually the butterfly that it's European skipper, and it's really detrimental to Timothy seed production. So there are some control options for that. I don't know exactly what they are, but I do know that we have information about that. And so, if you're seeing a lot of pretty blue butterflies, that you should be scouting your fields and your crops to see if you're getting a lot of damage. We monitor for something else that's becoming a kind of a big issue for us now, are clover weevils. So that is something that Jennifer's raised as a concern. They're seeing a lot more clover weevils come in fields. And so even though we don't do a lot of red clover seed production in the Peace, we actually still do quite a bit of alsike clover production.
Okay.
And so it's becoming, and so they don't really care whether it's red clover or outside clover, they're present in both crops. And so it is something we're seeing more and more of. So they've kind of are wanting to do more work to see, is it causing economic damages and so forth.
Right.
So yeah, those are some of the big ones that we monitor for. Other ones that we monitor with is cutworms. We look for cutworms, wireworms, and so on. And those are really detrimental. And those obviously live in the soil, but they can cause damage to the roots of the plants, which then can kill big patches of the crop. And so it's actually surprising how much damage they can do. So lots of times, if you're, guys will be scouting their fields in the spring, looking for maybe winter kill, and you'll see like these huge patches where actually wireworms or cutworms have come in and kind of decimated a big area.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we do grasshopper surveys because grasshoppers obviously love forage, and so doing, kind of monitoring those populations, and they have patterns, and some species, there's a few different species of grasshoppers that are present in the region, and they behave, differently, and so monitoring their populations, and so some of them will lay eggs, and those eggs will hatch in a year or two from when they're actually laid. So then, we can kind of estimate, and depending on, conditions in the fall, like was it conducive to egg laying? Did we see that happening quite a bit? When did moisture or weather patterns, did that affect it? And so then it kind of can predict in 2 years, we're going to have potentially a big, grasshopper population because, all these conditions were right for it and so forth. So we monitor that and go from there. So when we have two, so Jennifer basically looks after, her team at Beaver Lodge kind of looks after all of the Alberta piece. And because our association actually spans both sides of the province. And so we actually have a contractor on the BC side who then actually looks after all of the BC piece. And so he and his program is very similar to Jennifer's. She doesn't just look at forage seed crops, she monitors annual crops and forage seed crops and everything too. So his kind of actually, she helped us build that program. And so he mirrors her, and a lot of our stuff then just all goes to Beaver Lodge and gets ID'd and looked at there.
Cool.
Yeah, so it's another one that, pests and herbicides and things like that, I don't think those are ongoing. That's ongoing work that we'll always be doing. And I feel like even though we're doing it, for forage seed purposes, it's kind of cool because a lot of it is extremely relevant to forage production and things like that. So, we're, hopefully it's a benefit to both.
Absolutely. Well, it's all good information to know if you're going to be growing any kind of forage, whether you're going to silage it or you're going to try and grow some seed off it.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome, Talon. Now, is there anything we've missed that you'd like to mention before we sign off here?
I don't think so. I think that kind of is everything. And I really encourage, people to kind of take a look at our website. It can be found at www.peaceforageseed.ca, and we have a lot of our research is on there. And if not, then you can always feel free to reach out to me. And so, whether that be over, phone or email, I can be reached at coordinator@peaceforageseed.ca as well. And I'd be happy to help people find anything that they're looking for or so forth.
That's awesome. I will put the link to your website down in the description of the podcast. And if you have any fact sheets to Talon that you'd like to send me links for, I can put those in the description as well.
Okay, yeah, I do. We actually do have quite a few fact sheets on our websites and things like that explain, specifically even explaining exactly what growth regulators are and so on and stuff like that. So that would be great. Fantastic.
All right. So thank you everybody for listening. And if you're interested in any of the stuff we've sort of touched on, there'll be more information in the description. You can check out the Peace Forage Seed Association for more info. Thanks again for joining me today, Talon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Peace Country Beef and Forage Association is a research and extension group based out of Fairview, Alberta. Our mission is to help producers thrive in an agricultural system that is profitable, regenerative, and attractive to future generations. To learn more about what we do and see the results of our research trials or our archive of newsletters and fact sheets, check out our website at peacecountrybeef.ca. Want to get in touch? Have a burning question or a topic suggestion? Send us a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Thanks for listening.